Well, hello, everybody. Hello to everybody who is in the hall. Hello to everybody who's watching on the stream. I've got to say, this is not the way I was hoping to do this talk when I first applied to NDC Oslo, although months ago, but thank you to the organizers to get this together so that you can still watch it remotely and I can still give it remotely. Now, I love working with my colleagues. I love it when I can bounce ideas between each other, when I can use my knowledge to complement my colleagues' knowledge, and when we can use that combined talent to solve complex business or technical challenges. Basically, I love working in close-knit teams. Unfortunately, that hasn't quite happened as often as I would have liked it to have done during my career. All too often, I have seen teams where team members are working on completely different things. Maybe they are working on wildly different stories inside of the same project. I've even seen it where people are working on their own project inside of a team, so that everybody is working on something different, so that they can be, sometimes because they have to be, independent from each other. And I find that an interesting word, independent, especially in a team situation, because if this is how we're working, are we a team at all? Or are we simply a collection of independent colleagues working at the same island of desks? And this word, independent, it comes with costs. It's not free. Inside of my team, I now have less insight into what my colleagues are doing. Outside of that 15-minute stand-up, first thing in the morning, where none of us are really awake anyway, people are talking about totally unconnected things, and so we drift, we zone out. Basically, we just don't know what everybody's doing. And because of this disconnect, because some connection is lost between our team members, even if we're a really close team otherwise and we get on fantastically well, that whole thing that I like of bouncing ideas between each other, of helping each other, it suddenly becomes really, really hard. Because when we try to bounce things, when we try to help each other, it means we have to context switch. We have to interrupt what we're doing, or we have to interrupt our colleagues in what they're doing. It's not easy. And it gives our teams other issues as well. We now have way more work in progress. At the very least, one story per developer. My experience when I've seen people working like this, it's actually multiple stories per developer, because they get stuck in places, and because they can't interrupt anybody, they just pick up something new and they're going to come back to this at a later date. Each story takes longer to complete because there's only one person working on it. And testing in these situations, I've seen it be an absolute nightmare because we only have one tester in our team and everybody's throwing their finished things at them. And if each team member has their own set of stories, they have their own responsibility for what they're doing, then it also gives us issues with resilience. If everybody has their own area, then what happens when somebody wins the lottery? They quit the next day. Awesome for them, not so much for us. What happens if they go on vacation? Maybe that's a more likely scenario. Or even if they're just ill for a few days. All of these things interrupt our ability to get value out to our users in a timely fashion. But I'm supposed to be talking about pair programming, and I've not mentioned that yet. So why do I think these things are so connected? Well, in my experience, one of the ways that we can help teams to not fall into that trap of being independent colleagues at the same island of desks is to pair program. When practiced, when we do it right, we get to really, really work together. To think of those better solutions, to have that awesome collaboration between each other, and to implement value for our users with less lead time. Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I am honored to say that for the last 2 years, I've been able to call myself Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. I have been writing software commercially since the mid-1990s. And over the course of my career, I have worked in many different industries, many different companies, and quite a few different roles. And in all of that, I have seen lots of different ways that teams work together. Some of them have been better than others. In my previous job, I saw the whole gamut of ways that we can work together. I started there in 2006. I stayed there for 14 years. And we went through so many different ways of working together. When I first started, everybody was independent. We didn't have any teams. We just had a department. In fact, my first project on day one as an individual was to implement this really complex algorithm in the car insurance system they built. There were bigger projects. They did have more people working on them. But everybody was working on their own facet. They still weren't working as a team. They were deliberately not stepping on each other's toes. And we saw the issues that this could bring with resilience, with lead time, all the things I've talked about so far. And so in 2012, it was decided to try and help this. We were going to introduce Scrum and get people working together as a close-knit team. We made teams with stable team members, long-lived members of the team. We gave them responsibility for their own section of the product that we were building, and they were still individuals. They were still individuals within this team. In fact, we got questions coming out of the team of, how do you expect us to work on this project together? We're working on the same thing. We're working in the same file sometimes. We're treading on each other's toes. It's merge hell. It's slowing us down. Come on, this isn't working. Well, over the next 8 years, all of the teams tried to do various things to help themselves, and we tried to help teams do that. My last 2 years, I spent working with a team where experimentation was absolutely everybody's thing. We were always trying to find that one thing that we could tweak. What can we do to really help us work together? And pair programming became a huge part of this. And it was an amazing learning experience for me. Now, it took a huge amount of effort to get this work. Don't underestimate that. But we got dividends paid back on that effort that we put in, not only for us as developers, as a team, but also for the company itself. So if I'm saying it's so awesome, why isn't everybody just doing this? Why can it be such a controversial thing? Well, unfortunately, it is hard to get right. And there are a few things which, if they happen, and I'm going to be honest, if you start pairing, they're probably going to happen, at least in my experience, and they make pairing less than great. So I want to just talk about the most common ones and then see what we can do about it. So something that I call sleepy pairing. Anybody who's tried pairing before, I imagine that you've seen this situation. You have two people sitting behind one keyboard. You have one person, they are feverishly working away at that keyboard. They are working through the problem in their head. They're coming up with the solution. They're turning that into code. They're putting that code into the computer. They're swearing and fighting that code when it really doesn't do what they expect it to do. The other members of the pair, on the other hand, they're maybe not in such a great place. Generally, I've seen them do one or two things when they're sleepy pairing. Either they sit right behind the person at the keyboard. They're staring over their shoulder. They're watching every key press that person does, every mouse click. They're making that person at the keyboard feel really uncomfortable, really judged, but not really being that helpful. Or the other one that I've seen, you have somebody sitting a meter away, a little bit distracted. Maybe they're playing with their phone. Every now and then, they look up at the keyboard and they just do a grunt of, yep, before they return to Facebook, Twitter, shooting zombies on an MMO. And I liken this to a long car journey. You got that driver. They're concentrating the whole day. They are looking out for traffic problems on the road. They're trying to figure out which way they need to go to get everybody to the right place safely. Passengers, meanwhile, well, they're either struggling to stay awake or struggling to get to sleep. You have that backseat driver watching the person at the wheel, making them feel really uncomfortable, giving unwanted and unhelpful advice maybe sometimes. You have that person just staring out of the window, watching the world go by, not really noticing much. And you have that incredibly lucky person that doesn't get motion sickness, who just binge watch Netflix until the battery on their phone runs out. At the end of the journey, our driver, they've got a headache. They're exhausted. They've been concentrating so long. They want to close their eyes, stretch, find somewhere to recuperate. Passengers, well, they're stiff on the journey. They're bored. And put those two together and you've still got exhausted people. And so it is with our developers in sleepy pairing. That person doing the heavy lifting, they're more tired than they normally would have been. They're more tired because they've had exactly the same job. They've done exactly the same work as they ordinarily would have done. Only now they've done it with somebody staring over their shoulder and making them feel uncomfortable without actually being that much help. Our people watching, that person watching over the shoulder, don't underestimate how tiring it can be to just sit watching somebody press a keyboard and see what they're putting into the screen. But they've also got this nagging feeling that they've not been helping as much as they should have been, and is this a wise use of my time? That distracted person a meter away, they have an awesome score on that zombie game. But they also know that this is not what they're paid for, and they also feel useless because of what they've been doing. And so the next day, everybody returns to their own machines when we're allowed in offices, put on their noise-cancelling headphones to drown out their open plan office, and they go back to working independently. Everybody feels that the previous day, it was just a complete waste of time. And you know what? So's pairing. But it's not only the navigator that can be this sleepy. The driver can actually be sleepy too, believe it or not. And the results when this happen, they are just as bad. And I see this often when teams first try to use those driver navigator roles to get that interaction. We have the driver. They're at the keyboard. They're entering the code that they're told to put in. The navigator, they are thinking about the solution, solving the problems, and telling the driver what they need to type. Now, doing this does have an instant effect because that sleepy person who's taking over the navigator role, well, they can't yup anymore and they can't spend time killing zombies anymore. Because if they do either of those things, then they're not actively involved in telling the driver what to do, and the driver can't drive. We have that involvement from all parties. We are working together to solve problems. The navigator's coming up with ideas, thinking of solutions, telling the driver what to do. The driver's listening to this, putting the code into the computer. saying it like this sounds kind of idyllic. It's really what I want to be doing. People around the typist, they are actively involved. We have no more yupping, and we have no more zombies. Only, I'm not so sure. All too often in this situation, there is a zombie. It's just not the one in that MMO game. It is the typist. And I am using that word deliberately, typist. Sitting there, hanging in what they're told to put into the keyboard. But while they're doing this, they're not thinking about what they're putting into the keyboard. They're just typing it. Have you ever seen stories about drivers using satellite navigation that end up at the wrong destination? They do everything that the navigation system tells them to do, but they don't think about it. So they end up lost in the middle of a field, going the wrong way down a one-way street. In the worst cases I've seen, they maybe end up in water, or one person even ended up in the wrong country because the street and the town existed in two countries, and they were that intent on listening to the system that they didn't actually notice they crossed the border. Navigation system says, "You have arrived." And you think, well, yeah, maybe, but where? How did I get here? Are my feet wet? And in our pair, when this happens, at the end of the day, that person that's been doing all of the thinking, all of the problem solving, they are exhausted and they are frustrated. They are frustrated because they've been thinking of what they need to tell the driver what to type. But all this time, they've got to wait for that person typing to catch up with what they're saying. Because that typist, they're not using the shortcuts that they know would make this better. They're not using the tools that they know would make this better. They can't continue with their thoughts until the driver's caught up, because otherwise there's going to be way too much of a disconnect, and either one of them is going to end up completely and totally lost. They're not going to know what to do. And that typist, bashing those keys with no thought, they're exhausted. Yesterday, they were doing all of the heavy lifting themselves. Today, they're just simply putting an if statement on line 15 because that's what this other person tells them to do. And you know what? I did not become a developer just to put somebody else's words into a computer, not including Stack Overflow. And so the next day, we return to our own machines. We put on our noise-canceling headphones, drown out the open plan office, and we go back to working independently. That previous day, total waste of time. And you know what? Except for really complex issues, so is pair programming in general. And with these two issues, that sleepy navigator, that sleepy driver, teams can find it really hard to continue past this point. My experience has been when trying to do this with a team that you reach these points and it is so hard to break through that you just stop and give up. They're also used as some of the biggest reasons not to start. By companies I've spoken to, by developers that I've spoken to. It's not worth it. It is just too costly to pair. And so we give up before we even start. But there are things we can do so that we can make it that pairing not only works, but also to get those dividends back that I was talking about for the effort that needs to go into it. First of all, I want to tackle that sleepy navigator. When we really tried to break through this wall, the one thing that we noticed is our world is full of distractions. Some of them are real world distractions, again, when we're allowed back in the office. Like somebody have a meeting 2 desks down from you, talking loudly on the phone, somebody wandering past in your peripheral vision and grabbing your attention, somebody interrupting you when you're the navigator, because you know what? You're a software developer. And if you're not busy typing on the keyboard, then obviously you're not busy, because that's all I do with my time. Some are more virtual, like our phones. Most of us are addicted to our phones. I'm ashamed to say that I know that I am. And they provide an absolute world of different distractions for us. Email, Slack, Teams, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, all of these things. And we get tiny little dopamine hits every time we check the notifications for these applications. It's been shown that our brains actually change physically because of how we use our phones. Our brains change physically because of how we use our phones. And if your fingers aren't busy dancing on that keyboard typing, it can become really easy to give in to the distraction of playing with the phones. Normally, when I have the chance to give this talk in person, there's generally one or two people in the audience looking just a little bit sheepish round about now, trying to hide the phone that they're using. Now, changing this particular issue is a very personal thing. Everybody needs to figure out what works for them. So I can only talk about what worked for me at this point. It may work for you, it may not. It took a huge amount of mental energy to stop doing this. First thing I did is just simply try not to have the phone where I could see the notifications pop up. I put it on the desk next to me. That didn't work. All I did was just stretch to the next desk, check the phone, and then stretch and put it back. Great for the daily workout. Maybe not quite so good for actually trying to stop the distraction. I realized I had to get rid of the phone completely. I had to get it to a point where I couldn't easily reach it just by stretching. And I paired a lot with the person who sat opposite me, so our monitors were back to back. And one day I just got my phone and I gently tossed it underneath the monitors onto my desk. Gently, it's a glass smartphone, it's not a Nokia 3310. And it meant that in order to check my phone now, I've actually got to physically stand up and walk around the island of desks. And you know what? I'm not doing that. The impact was instant. I hurt. Like, really, it felt awful. It was horrible. Like I say, I'm addicted to my phone. But it did also work. My concentration went up. And over time, the pain went away. I could concentrate better. It was a very good experience. I realized that most of the things that I'm checking, you know what, they're not urgent, not Twitter, WhatsApp, etc. It's just fear of missing out. Is there something happening that I don't know about? Is there something in the Lego group that's like really cool and interesting? This habit. The email issue specifically, that was a lot harder. See, when I'm working at my own machine, I could see the notification when I got an email, and I could see whether or not it was urgent. Now, we can have a discussion about whether or not that's a good thing, but I think that's a different talk. But being able to see that email meant that I knew if somebody had an urgent question that needed answering in the next half an hour, if there was a major issue that was going to cause us problems and I needed to help solve it, if production's on fire and the website's down and I need to do something now, all of these things I knew when I had access to my email. Now, when pairing on somebody else's machine, obviously I don't have my email, but I do have my phone, and I could check that. When I got rid of my phone, I can't even do that anymore, and it did make me panic a little bit of what happens if something bad occurs because I'm not checking this. But after a time, I came to realize that would never, ever happen. If something is that urgent that me not responding straight away is going to cause an issue, a question that needs answering, a problem that needs solving, a real production outage, people aren't going to fire off an email and forget about it. If I don't answer, they're going to come and find me and they're going to drag me into the solution. If they don't, then you know what? It's just simply not that important, and I didn't need to be involved. I can carry on doing what I'm doing. So we worked to move those distractions, and we all did our own thing, and we got into the flow, and we did start to work better as a pair. But it was only the navigator that we were changing at this point. We still needed to tackle that sleepy driver. This one wasn't a personal thing. This one we solved as a team. And the way that we did it is re-examine the definitions that we had for the driver and the navigator. Tighten them up just a little bit. So we ended up with a navigator, somebody who thinks of a solution, but not somebody who tells the driver to put that if statement on line 15. No, they explain their idea to the driver. They help the driver understand what they're trying to achieve and allow the driver to produce their own code. The driver listens to the navigator. They do their best to understand what the navigator's trying to explain, and they turn that understanding into their own code and put it into the machine. To return to our driving metaphor one last time. When you're driving and you're using satellite navigation, your job isn't just to listen to it and do what it says without thinking. Your job is to take those instructions, to think about them, to check that they're right. Is this the way that I need to go to get to my destination? To check that it's safe to use. I'm not going to cross 5 lanes of motorway to take this exit when it's not safe. I'm going to carry on to the next exit, turn around and come back. Your job is to get your passengers and your vehicle to the correct location safely. And so it is with the driver in a pair. You don't just follow those instructions about that if statement. You listen to the navigator, you understand what they're saying, and you use that to come up with your own code. And if you can't do that because you don't understand what they're trying to achieve, you simply don't code anything. As a navigator, when this happens, you need to help the driver. You need to explain it differently. And if you find that you're really struggling to get onto that same place of understanding verbally, go to a whiteboard, start drawing, do something different to get that interaction, to get that collaboration, and to make sure you have the shared understanding to continue. What you don't do, which I've seen happen more often than I would like, is simply grab the keyboard and start writing the code that you think should be written. You don't do that because when you do, that other person is immediately in a sleepy pair again. They don't understand the solution, they're not involved in the solution, and they're not involved in getting the code into the machine. They are completely outside of the process. Drivers, don't think you've got it any easier. When you understand what the navigator's saying, they are explaining their solution, and suddenly it goes click inside of your mind. You have this amazing idea now. You've seen what they're trying to do, and you can build on that. You have an even better idea. What you don't do is put your undoubtedly awesome solution into the computer yourself. Rather, you excitedly give your keyboard to the navigator, and you tell them about your amazing idea, and you switch roles. Because again, the second you have this awesome idea and you go with it at the keyboard, that navigator, they're not involved in the solution. They don't know what you're doing, and they're not doing anything with code. They are sleepy yet again. If we can do this, if we can practice and fulfill the roles in this way, with everybody not being distracted, being active members of a pair, then we can move from sleepy pairing into strong pairing. But everything I've mentioned so far has kind of been working individually or together in an office, face-to-face. I'm speaking to you from the Netherlands, to people online and a handful of people in the room. That doesn't really happen that often anymore, does it? So let's talk remote for a few minutes. I first gave this talk to a conference in 2020, and I was lucky enough at that same conference to be invited to discuss a subject on .NET Rocks Live that was happening the next day. We're having a great discussion. And then at one point, either Carl or Richard, I can't remember who, asked me, what about pairing remotely? This was a curveball for me. I wasn't expecting that question, and it threw me. And if you ever listen back to that episode, I think you can tell that I was thrown, because basically the first thing I said was, well, I have done it once. And it did work well. My colleague and I, we were busy pairing in the morning, but in the afternoon, I needed to be at home for some reason, but we wanted to continue. Now, our machines at that point, bearing in mind this is pre-pandemic, we didn't have audio, we didn't have video, we weren't allowed those on our machines for some reason. And so we ended up pairing, communicating via Slack, communicating via a notepad that was opened on the screen that we were sharing via some application, I've forgotten which. It was really hard. But it did work for us. It wasn't as good as in person, but it did work for us. But I followed up that story with a proviso. I think that this will only work if you have the psychological safety in place before you start to pair remotely. And I want to just go into a quick aside here, because it's something which you shouldn't underestimate in pair programming. You need that psychological safety, because you need to be open about where your understanding stops. You need to be open when you're not following something. You need to be open about the gaps in your knowledge about the tech stack, about the domain. And most of all, you need to be able to be told when someone thinks you're doing the wrong thing. It can be really hard to do that. Now, my colleague and I, we had an awesome working relationship. We paired quite often together in the office. In fact, we paired too often in the office because we ended up not pairing with the other members of the team enough. But we did it because we gelled so well together. We could bounce off of each other. We came up with some awesome solutions and had a lot of fun doing it too. So the hardships offered by our woefully inadequate environment for remote pairing, they didn't hit us too hard. But if you don't have that trust and that safety before you start remote pairing, I don't see how that can work that well, because it's just going to offer too many challenges. This was 3 weeks before lockdown happened in the Netherlands that I was involved in this session. Yeah, things changed. I was also changing jobs at that time. And I literally got back to the Netherlands the next day after that conference and walked into my new office. And those first 3 weeks, I actually spent annoying my colleagues more than I was getting to know them. You see, my job there was also to help them change how they worked. And let's face it, nobody really likes that. It can be really confrontational. And so I didn't have any psychological safety working with those people. Suddenly, we are all working from home. And to my surprise, people started to pair, which they didn't generally do in the office. In fact, teams started to do mob sessions, just starting a meeting first thing in the morning in their Teams channel and going through it until the end of the day. And people came and left as they needed to, and it went. And they did that remotely without building up that level of trust. And it worked. Had some issues, but you know what? It worked. The teams actually really started to enjoy it. And I think one of the things was it gave them a connection that they lost with their colleagues when they weren't in the same room. I think if you're in the same office, even if you're not pairing together, you go for breaks together, you go for a walk together, a coffee together, you have lunch together. None of these things happen when you're remote. You're just sitting in your living room, your bedroom, if you're lucky enough, your study at home. And they missed that connection, and the pairing gave them that connection back. It wasn't without challenges, though. It exaggerated those issues that we can have with face-to-face pair programming. And whilst I'm not going to go too in-depth here, I don't think a remote talk on pairing in COVID times is complete without maybe touching on it. So firstly, sleepy pairing that was just so much harder to avoid when we were remote. The whole team had to work super hard to try and make sure that everybody stayed engaged. It can be hard when you're next to each other. When you're remote, it's just wildly difficult sometimes. We noticed that people disappeared from our streams. They weren't joining in, but we didn't notice that they weren't joining in. Some people put themselves on mute because of background noise where they were. Some people didn't feel comfortable with a camera, so they turned their video off. Especially if they felt they didn't have anything to contribute at that time. When they're looking at a blurry, shared, shrunken screen because of all the resolution differences that we were using. And so they faded away. And whereas in the office, face to face, we can spot this and we can try and, get a spark back into the session. We can suggest a drink, a walk, a break, just snap people out of it and come back and continue. When you can't physically see that other person and they fade away, it's just really hard to get them back in. And on top of these reasons for fading away, all those distractions I was talking about with the phone. How many people sit and watch meetings online with the phone in their hand because it's not visible? It's just so much harder to avoid. Another issue that we saw is that switching roles, which is something you really need to do in a pair to make sure the right person is navigating, it just didn't happen as often as we would have liked. Now, it can be hard to make sure that you have that switching of roles in person too. It's even harder when you're not sitting next to each other, especially in the beginning. Our workflow for switching roles was commit, hopefully working code to the repo, push it. The person who's going to take over driving, they need to then pull that repo. They need to open the solution, wait for Visual Studio to do what it needs to do, and then they can continue. And all of those things add up to one gigantic context switch. And they actually made it quite hard sometimes to remember what your idea was when you were actually going to do this switch. And so we noticed that the chances are people just didn't switch as often as they should have done. Sometimes there was one person driving for a whole morning. Now, obviously, they weren't thinking that whole morning, well, they were thinking that whole morning, but because of this workflow, they didn't switch it around, and it also leads to people getting really tired. The driver gets a lot more, I want to say sleepy, but it's also focused. They get sleepy because they start to zone out the people who aren't in the room with them, and they get focused because they just start to do that whole, I have the idea, I have the keyboard, I'm just going to put it in, and if somebody doesn't like it, they will stop me. They lose sight of the rest of the virtual room. It's also harder to bounce ideas when you're in a virtual setting. First up, you might only have voice. If that person doesn't like having the camera run, you are talking to a little circle with initials in it. That is harder. You don't see the body language of that person. Even if they've got the video on, they're not going to be standing this distance from the camera. They're going to be standing here next to the camera, and you kind of lose a lot of the body language and just see their face. We find conversation easier when we're face-to-face. You're in a room with 5 people, and people start to talk. One, sometimes you can just listen to one or the other of the conversations. Or you can go, hey, please, folks, stop. Can we have, keep this central? Can we have one conversation, please, so that we can all follow along? Doing that remotely is harder. It can be harder to be the person saying, hey, can we stop this and just have one conversation? And when you have multiple people talking, it all comes over the same channel. It gets mixed in the speakers in your headphones, and it can be impossible to follow along. what did we do to try and help things? Well, first up, we tried not to share the screen if possible. We tried to use things like live share. Now, this experience has been interesting. Sometimes it is absolutely awesome. Sometimes it is profanity-inducing annoyingness. But when it works, it is great because I'm no longer looking at somebody else's HD plus widescreen monitor on my 16:10 screen. That person with a HD plus widescreen monitor, they're not looking at my 4K screen on theirs. And it means neither one of us has that squashed up, blurry text that we had previously. I'm using my own monitor. I'm using my own IDE. I'm using my own themes, my own extensions. I have my own setup. And I can take over at a moment's notice without interrupting our workflow. And for those moments where we couldn't use live share, we noticed that the bigger the solution, the worse it worked. Well, we just tried to find ways of forcing ourselves to at least switch drivers frequently. And one of the teams started to use the Pomodoro technique to do this. 25 minutes, we are going to solve this task. And at the end of it, we are going to switch drivers no matter what. And it meant that worst case scenario, if somebody's zoned out, they're probably only going to lose like 15 minutes. But it also made it less likely that that person's going to zone out because they know they're going to be taking over at the end. And they kind of need to make sure they stay focused. But they also get that 5-minute break so that they can get their thoughts together before continuing. Not perfect, but it did keep people engaged. Finally, we tried to make sure that one of us tried to take on the devil's advocate role in the pair. If we're in a mob session with more than 2 people, then actually we had one person who really took it to heart and they loved playing that role, questioning our assumptions, making sure that people were all on the same page and not just silently disagreeing with each other. If somebody felt they didn't have anything to contribute, then they at least asked them to validate their thoughts and made sure to try and pull them into the conversation so that we could share ideas and get insight that we would have otherwise missed. That really helped people from straying too much. Don't get me wrong, I still think that remote pairing is way harder than face-to-face pairing, but if the discipline's there, it can still work amazingly well. A few teams have this as their default way of working now. It wasn't forced on them. They just start sessions early in the morning and carry on during the day. And I know that some teams are planning on doing this even when they get back to the office because they've seen the benefits that it's brought them over the last 2 years. So what benefits am I talking about here? Why do I like this so much? Well, first up is collaboration. We are now really working together. We're not working on different things. We are all focused working on the same thing, trying to get it finished. We are bouncing ideas between each other in order to get that work finished. We are helping each other improve our domain knowledge, improve our tech stack knowledge, improve our craft at constructing software. We are using our joint talents to solve those problems together. We have better communication than we used to do. And I'm going to be honest, this one is a little bit chicken and egg for me. I honestly don't know whether or not we managed to improve our conversation and that helped our ability to pair program, or whether or not we improved the way that we pair programmed and our communication organically grew as we did. Either way, our communication did improve, and we are now sharing knowledge so much better than we did before. In fact, we are sharing it as a default state. It's just what we do. Now, this means that when that person wins the lottery and quits the next day, or when somebody goes on vacation, or if somebody's ill, it might not be great, but it doesn't give us that huge problem anymore because we don't lose all of the knowledge. Because we're pairing with each other, there's always at least 2 people who've got an idea what's going on. And that second person in the pair, they can continue. In fact, they can pull somebody else in. They can start a new pair, and we can share the knowledge yet again. The other thing that we saw that worked for us, and I know that this can be controversial, but our PR process just became so much smoother and so much simpler when we got this right, because it became an ongoing process. As a driver, I am validating the thoughts of the navigator, trying to understand what they're trying to achieve and see if I think it is the right thing, and I am doing that in real time. The navigator is validating the code I'm producing based on my understanding, not only validating that, yep, this is what I meant, but also validating that the solution that I'm making is a good one. They're also checking that, hold on, is this actually doing what we hoped it was going to do, or are we going off at a tangent here? And that meant that when we came to need to do our pull requests, and in a pair, we managed to keep these smaller because we kept each other on our toes. What we did was just double check the changes that we were going to make to a commit, just to make sure that nothing untoward had snuck in, which is always possible. And to make sure that, yeah, the way that we've solved this really is the way that we want to solve this. It's really important that you do not skip this step, because if you do skip this step, most of this advantage actually just kind of disappears in a puff of smoke. But when we do this, the code's been checked, we've committed it, we've made a pull request. Navigator just goes around and approves it now. We go grab a drink before carrying on with our next task. So much better than what we were doing before. We used to throw it over the fence at somebody, and that person is then annoyed because either they've got to context switch out of what they're doing and get into my headspace, or they're just going to wait for their next natural break and then they can pick it up. I've started something new, which means when they make their comments or have questions and they throw it over the fence back to me, I now have to context switch back to what I was doing previously to check what they're saying. And this can ping pong backwards and forwards until it's accepted. And I've seen people take days for this, and you can say that it shouldn't or whatever else, but it still happened. Even worse, if you've made a pull request which is too big, and someone finds something fundamental that they want to change in your pull request, one or two things happen. Either the whole thing's wasted and you've got to start again, or you put that wonderful comment in the pull request, yep, I agree with this, but I'm going to finish this pull request and then I'm going to go back and re-examine it. Putting code that we know shouldn't be in the trunk into the trunk because it's too costly to fix. When we do the PR on the fly, we catch that early, and we catch it at the point where it's the cheapest to fix. Not only that, the only context switch that we actually have is when we stand up and go and get that drink before continuing, and you know what? I actually think that that is kind of an acceptable context switch to have. The last benefit that I want to talk about today was regarding our onboarding process. Now, when we first started to pair, we didn't even think about this, but we did notice that it became really, really useful for us. When you start a job, it's a daunting task, at least it is for me. You get introduced to all of these people whose names you instantly forget. You get a new machine and you install it, and then you get this giant stack of paperwork. These days, maybe a giant wiki. And on a really complex system, it can be hard to work through that, look at the code, interrupt other people, and get up to speed with not only the solution that's there, but also the way of working. Well, how about we do this differently? How about after that person has forgotten everybody's names again, and after they have installed their new machine, we simply get them to pair with an experienced person in their team. This newbie in the team, they get all of the insights and the experience of the partner about how the domain works, where to find code, how the solution is set up, how the team develops code, and, just as importantly, why we made certain choices in the past. Their partner, this experienced person, they also get something out of this. It's not that they have to do this for no reason. They get that clear insight that only somebody with no preconceived thoughts about a project can bring in when they see it for the first time. Now, don't get me wrong, having two experienced people pairing together is going to be more productive than having the newbie and the experienced person working together. But you do still get productivity. That person is productive out of the box. They are learning on the fly, and they feel that they can make a contribution. Now, I want to finish on why I advocate, why I am so enthusiastic about pair programming, and why I try and do it so often. Because I often get asked in real life, why do you do this? Why do you like it? It's not like it really works, does it? Well, you know what? I advocate for it and I get enthusiastic about it because of something G. Paul Hill says about test-driven development. Because I'm in this for the money. When we practice it, when we get it right, we get value into the hands of our users much, much quicker. We get that value there with more thought put into it, more thought put into how it works, and more thought put into how it's built. I love pairing. I love pairing with one person. I love it when I'm in a mob of people and we're all bouncing between each other. I love it because of the benefits that I see that it brings to me as an individual and to the teams that I've worked with. Now, make no mistake, this is seriously hard. It is not easy. If it was easy, I'm sure we'd all be doing it and I wouldn't be talking to you about it. But it can work, and when it works, it is awesome. So I invite you to give it a go, to put that effort in, to get through those sleepy stages and find what you need to do to make it work for you and to see what benefits it can bring. I'm Stacy Cashmore. I want to thank you so much for your time this morning. Okay. And then, well, if there's no questions, I guess you all have a little bit of extra time for coffee before the next session. Thank you so much for your attention.